There's nothing quite like the pain of being left behind by the people you love most. For Jorund the Broad-Back, that moment came when his own family sailed away without him, deeming their once mighty warrior father too old and broken to keep. Most men would have given up. Most would have sat among those crumbling ruins and waited to die. But Jorund was different. This old Viking giant took those ancient stones and started building something beautiful. He turned a place of death into a garden paradise. Where battles once raged, flowers now bloom. Where enemies fell, peaceful streams flow. For years he worked alone, creating something extraordinary from nothing but ruins and determination. His hands that once swung axes now plant seeds. His voice that once roared war cries now sings to the birds. But what happens when his family finally returns to see what he's built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and Jorund the Broad-Back emerged from his stone shelter as he had every dawn for the past 7 winters. His massive frame, though bent slightly with age, still commanded respect from the ravens that perched on the ancient walls. They knew him now, these black-winged sentinels, and they no longer scattered at his approach. In his weathered hands, he carried the morning's first treasure, a bucket of fresh water drawn from the spring he had discovered beneath the fortress's foundation. The water was pure and cold, fed by underground streams that had flowed here since the world was young. He had learned to read the land like he once read the faces of enemies across a battlefield. Understanding its moods and secrets through patient observation, the ruins of Ironhold stretched around him in weathered grandeur. Once these walls had sheltered 300 souls. The great hall had echoed with the clash of ale-horns and the recounting of glorious deeds. Now ivy claimed the stones, and wildflowers pushed through cracks that time had widened into smiles. But Jorund saw beauty in this decay, potential in every fallen beam and scattered stone. At the heart of his domain sat the ancestral hearthstone, a massive carved boulder that had once anchored the great hall's central fire. The stone bore the intricate knotwork of his forefathers, serpents and wolves, intertwining in patterns that told the story of his bloodline. A great crack ran through its center now, splitting the ancient carving like a scar across the face of memory. Yet Jorund had not moved it, had not tried to repair it. Some wounds, he understood, were meant to remain visible. He set down his bucket and placed both hands on the cold stone, feeling the familiar ache in his joints that came with each morning's awakening. 7 years ago, when his son Eric had stood in this very spot and declared him too old for the raid on Wessex, Jorund had felt something break inside him that was deeper than bone, sharper than any blade. The crack in the hearthstone seemed to mirror that inner fracture, a physical manifestation of the moment his family had sailed away without looking back. Too slow. "Father," Eric had said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of youth impatient with age. "Too weak. The men need leaders who can keep pace with the tide of battle." Jorund's daughter Astrid had stood beside her brother, her blue eyes, so like her mother's, unable to meet his gaze. "It's for the best, Papa," she had whispered. "You've earned your rest. Rest. As if a warrior's life could be set aside like a dull blade. As if the fire that had burned in his chest for 6 decades could simply be extinguished by the convenience of his children's ambitions. But they had been wrong about the fire. It still burned, though differently now. Where once it had raged like a wildfire consuming enemies, now it glowed steady and warm, feeding not destruction but creation. Jorund had discovered something in his abandonment that he had never known in all his years of conquest. The profound satisfaction of building rather than breaking. He moved through his morning ritual with the precision of a man who had found purpose in solitude. First, the inspection of his gardens. Where the old armory had stood, he had coaxed roses to climb trellises made from broken spear hafts. Their red blooms were particularly beautiful in the early light. like drops of blood transformed into something worthy of admiration rather than mourning. The ravens followed him on his rounds, hopping from stone to stone with the casual familiarity of old friends. The largest of them, a magnificent bird with a white patch on his breast, had been Jorund's companion for 3 years now. He called the creature Munin, after one of Odin's messengers, though this raven brought no news from distant halls, only the simple companionship of shared solitude. "Good morning, old friend," Jorund murmured, and Munin responded with a low croak that almost sounded like conversation. Beyond the roses lay his vegetable plots, where he grew everything he needed to sustain himself through the harsh winters. Cabbages and turnips, hardy grains that could weather the storms that swept down from the mountains. He had learned to read the sky like an ancient text, understanding which clouds brought rain and which carried the bite of early frost. These were skills no warrior needed, but they had kept him alive and healthy when lesser men might have starved or sickened in isolation. At the far end of his domain, where the fortress walls crumbled away into the natural rock of the cliff face, Jorund had created his masterpiece. Through patient work and careful engineering, he had diverted a mountain stream to flow through the ruins in a series of cascades and pools. The water sang as it fell, a constant melody that replaced the silence he had once found so oppressive. Here, among the moss-covered stones and the gentle splash of falling water, he had built a shrine to memory, not to the gods, though he still honored them in his way, but to the moments of his life that had shaped him. A smooth stone for his wife Sigrid, who had died birthing their 3rd child. A piece of driftwood for his brother Thorvald, lost in the Irish seas. And yes, even stones for Eric and Astrid, though they lived still. In leaving him, they had died to him in a way that cut deeper than any physical loss. Yet as the seasons turned and his gardens grew, Jorund found that the bitterness had slowly transformed into something else. Not forgiveness. He was not certain he would ever forgive the casual cruelty of their abandonment, but understanding. They were young and strong and hungry for glory, just as he had been once. They saw his age as weakness, his deliberate pace as failure, his quiet wisdom as defeat. They would learn, as all warriors learned eventually, that strength came in many forms. The young tree bends in the storm and thinks itself mighty for not breaking, while the old oak knows that true strength lies in roots that run deep and wood that has weathered many seasons. Jorund tended to his water feature with the care of a master craftsman, adjusting stones to improve the flow, clearing debris that might disrupt the peaceful music of falling water. This work required no sword, no shield, no battle cry to announce his prowess. It demanded only patience, observation, and the willingness to try again when his first attempts failed to achieve the harmony he sought. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, he paused to rest on a bench he had carved from a fallen beam. From here, he could see the fjord stretching toward the open sea, its dark waters reflecting the sky like polished obsidian. Sometimes, on clear days, he could make out the white sails of distant ships, and his heart would quicken with the old hope that perhaps today would bring his children home. But 7 years had passed without word, and hope was a luxury he had learned to ration like grain in a hard winter. Instead, he found satisfaction in the work itself, in the daily acts of creation and maintenance that gave shape to his solitude. Each stone placed with intention, each plant nurtured to bloom, each improvement to his sanctuary, these were victories that no one could take from him, achievements that required no witness to validate their worth. The truth was that Jorund had discovered something profound in his exile. He was not diminished by being alone, but revealed, stripped of the roles that had defined him. Father, husband, war leader, he had found the man beneath, the one who had always existed but had been buried under the weight of others' expectations and needs. This man was quieter than the legendary berserker, more thoughtful than the strategic commander, more patient than the ambitious young warrior who had carved his name into the memory of enemies across the northern seas. This man built things that would outlast him, created beauty that asked nothing in return but the simple pleasure of existing. As afternoon settled over Ironhold, Jorund made his way to the highest tower, the one structure he had rebuilt completely. Here, where sentries had once watched for approaching enemies, he had created a different kind of lookout, a place of contemplation where he could sit with his thoughts and watch the world change with the passing hours. The climb was harder now than it had been, even 2 years ago, his knees protesting each step, his breathing growing labored long before he reached the top. But the view was worth the effort. From here, he could see his entire domain spread below him like a living map of his transformation. The gardens, the water features, the careful restoration of selected buildings, the way nature and human intention had learned to coexist in harmony. This was his legacy now. Not the battles won or the enemies slain, but this quiet testament to the possibility of renewal. When death finally came for him, and he could feel it circling closer with each passing season, patient as a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment, this would remain. Not forever, perhaps. Nature would eventually reclaim even his most careful work. But for a time, for long enough, it would stand as proof that Jorund the Broad-Back had been more than just a weapon wielded by other men's ambitions. As evening painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, he heard the familiar sound of Munin's wings. The great raven settled beside him on the stone parapet, as had become their custom, and together they watched the day surrender to night. In the growing darkness, Jorund's sanctuary took on a different quality, the gentle splash of water becoming more prominent as the visual details faded into shadow. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, another opportunity to improve and expand his creation. There were always new projects to consider, repairs to make, seasonal adjustments to implement. The work was never truly finished, and he had come to appreciate that endless quality, the way it gave structure and purpose to days that might otherwise drift past unmarked and unmourned. But tonight, as stars emerged in the darkening sky and the first owls began their haunting calls, Jorund allowed himself to wonder what Eric and Astrid would think if they could see what he had built. Would they recognize the warrior they had abandoned in the careful hands that had shaped this paradise? Would they understand that strength could flow in directions they had never imagined? The questions hung in the night air like the mist that would rise from the fjord before dawn, beautiful and insubstantial, impossible to grasp but impossible to ignore. And in the end, perhaps that was enough, to have questions worth asking. Work worth doing and a place of beauty to call home, even if he was the only one left to appreciate what he had created from the bones of abandonment and the fertile soil of solitude. The ship appeared on the horizon like a memory given form, its single square sail dark against the morning sky. Jorund spotted it from his watchtower as he performed his daily survey of the fjord, and for a moment his heart forgot its measured rhythm. 7 years of solitude had not dulled his ability to read the water and the vessels that travelled upon it, and this was no merchant trader or fishing boat seeking shelter from storms. This was a dragon ship, built for war. Munin sensed his tension and took flight, circling the tower with harsh cries that seemed to echo Jorund's sudden unease. The old warrior gripped the stone parapet with hands that had not trembled in battle, but found themselves unsteady now in the face of this unexpected visitation. The ship moved with purpose, cutting through the dark water with the efficiency of a blade through flesh. As it drew closer, details emerged that made Jorund's breath catch in his throat. The prow bore a carved wolf's head, its wooden maw snarling defiance at the waves. The shields hung along the gunwales were painted in patterns he recognized, red and black, the colors of the Bloodaxe clan. These were not his kinsmen returning, but something far more dangerous. The Bloodaxe clan had been enemies of his family for 3 generations, a blood feud that stretched back to a disputed inheritance and a bride stolen on her wedding day. Jorund had fought them many times in his younger years, had driven their ships from these very waters with flame and steel, but that was when he commanded 100 warriors, when Ironhold's walls sheltered armed men ready to die for their lord's honor. Now he was alone, an aging giant tending gardens where warriors once trained, With no weapon save the eating knife at his belt, and no armor save the leather apron he wore while working his soil. The irony was bitter as winter mead. After 7 years of peace and creation, war had come calling when he was least prepared to answer. The ship's approach was deliberate, unhurried. They had seen the smoke from his morning fire, knew someone dwelt among these ruins. Whether they recognized Ironhold for what it had been, whether they knew Jorund still lived here, remained to be seen. But their intentions were clear in the way they maneuvered toward the natural harbor below the fortress, their oars moving in the practiced rhythm of men who had traveled far for a specific purpose. Jorund descended from the tower with careful haste, his mind racing through possibilities as his feet found the familiar path down the ancient stone steps. He could try to hide, hope they would see only abandoned ruins and pass by. But his gardens and improvements were too obvious, too well maintained to suggest a truly empty stronghold. And hiding had never been his way, even when wisdom counseled retreat. By the time he reached the main courtyard, the voices of the invaders carried up from the harbor on the morning wind. Their dialect was thick with the harsh consonants of the northern islands, but he could make out enough to understand their purpose. They spoke of plunder, of ancient treasures supposedly hidden in Ironhold's depths, of settling an old score that had festered too long. One voice rose above the others, commanding and cruel, and Jorund's blood ran cold as he recognized it. Ragnar Bloodaxe, son of his old enemy Grim, now grown to manhood and carrying his father's hatred like an inheritance. The boy would be, 30 summers now? In his prime, hungry for glory and wealth, leading a crew of men equally eager to whet their blades. The cursed longship anchor lay half-buried in the courtyard where Jorund had been using it as the base for a fountain. Its iron shaft twisted into an elegant spiral that caught and reflected sunlight in patterns that danced across the water's surface. Legend claimed this anchor had belonged to a ship cursed to sail forever, unless its crew found redemption through acts of mercy. Jorund had always doubted the tale, but looking at it now, a weapon of war transformed into art, he wondered if perhaps there was truth in old stories after all. The sound of boots on stone reached his ears as the raiders found the path up from the harbor. They moved with the casual confidence of men who expected no resistance, their voices loud and careless. Jorund could hear them commenting on the state of the ruins, the unexpected signs of habitation, the curious modifications that spoke of long residence rather than temporary shelter. "Someone's been living here," one of them called out, his tone carrying the anticipation of easy prey. "See how the stones are fitted. This is no squatter's hovel. Better for us," came Ragnar's response, closer now, perhaps at the outer gate. "A caretaker will know where the old treasures are buried. We'll have our answers soon enough." Jorund moved to the center of his courtyard, near the fountain where the twisted anchor caught the light. If they were coming for him, he would not meet them cowering in some corner like a beaten dog. 7 years of peace had not erased the warrior's code that had governed his younger years. Better to face danger with dignity than to die in shameful hiding when they entered. Through the gap where the great gates had once stood, Jorund was waiting for them. 12 men in byrny mail and iron helms, their weapons already drawn, though they had seen no threat. They moved with the swagger of raiders who had found easier prey than expected, their eyes already calculating the value of what they saw. Ragnar Bloodaxe walked at their head, and Jorund felt the strange sensation of looking at a ghost made flesh. The young man bore his father's hawk nose and cold grey eyes, the same cruel smile that had haunted battlefield nightmares in years past. But where Grim had been thick and brutal, his son carried himself with a predator's lean grace, all sinew and sharp edges. "Well, well," Ragnar said, his voice carrying mock surprise that fooled no one. "The legendary Jorund the Broad-Back, keeper of ruins and tender of flowers. How the mighty have fallen." The other raiders spread out around the courtyard, professional in their movements, blocking potential escape routes, while seeming to examine Jorund's improvements with exaggerated interest. One of them poked at the fountain with his spear point, sending ripples across the still water. "Pretty work," the man said with sneering appreciation. "Our wives would love such decorations. Perhaps we'll take this anchor back with us. Let our smiths copy the design." "Touch nothing," Jorund said quietly, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority he had once wielded over hundreds. "You are not welcome here." Ragnar laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Welcome? Old man, you forget yourself. This is Blood Axe business now. My father died cursing your name, swearing his sons would finish what he started. I've come to collect on that promise." "Your father was a fool and a coward," Jorund replied with deliberate calm. "I assume the apple falls close to the tree." The words had their intended effect. Ragnar's face darkened, his hand moving to his sword hilt with the quick anger of youth insulted before his followers. But he did not draw the blade, not yet. He was smarter than his father had been, more calculating in his cruelty. "Bold words for a man who stands alone against 12, Ragnar said. "But we didn't come here just to kill you, though that would be pleasure enough. We came for information. The treasure hoard of Ironhold. My grandfather spoke of gold and silver hidden in these walls, artifacts of power that your family claimed as their own. You will tell us where they are hidden." Jorund almost smiled at the irony. These fools had travelled far and risked much for treasures that had never existed, at least not in the way their legends claimed. Ironhold's wealth had been in its people, its strategic position, its ability to control trade through the fjord. The few precious items his family had owned had sailed away with Eric and Astrid, family heirlooms too valuable to leave with an abandoned old man. But he said none of this. Instead, he stood straight and met Ragnar's gaze with the steady composure of a man who had faced death many times and found it less frightening than dishonor. "There are no treasures here," he said simply. "Only an old man's attempt to build something beautiful from the bones of the past." "Liar," Ragnar snarled, his patience already wearing thin. "Search the ruins. Tear apart his pretty gardens if you must. The gold is here somewhere, and we will find it." As his men dispersed to begin their destructive search, Jorund felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. They would destroy everything he had built. All the careful work of 7 years, all the beauty he had coaxed from stone and soil. His sanctuary would become rubble once more, his legacy trampled beneath the boots of men who understood only taking, never making. The inciting incident of his long exile had been abandonment by those he loved. Now, in bitter symmetry, it seemed that the end would be marked by the destruction of everything he had created in response to that abandonment. But Jorund the Broad-Back had not survived 6 decades of warfare by accepting defeat at the first sign of overwhelming odds. If they wanted to destroy his paradise, they would pay a price for the privilege. The old wolf still had teeth, and perhaps it was time to remember how to use them. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the morning air as Ragnar's men began their systematic destruction of Jorund's sanctuary. They attacked his carefully tended rose garden first, their boots trampling delicate blooms while they overturned the trellises made from ancient spear hafts. The sight of red petals scattered like blood drops across the stone made something dark and familiar stir in Jorund's chest, a sensation he had not felt in 7 years' rage, pure and simple and clean, as a blade fresh from the forge. "Stop," he said. But his voice carried no authority here, no power to halt the desecration of his life's work. He was one old man against 12 warriors in their prime, and they knew it as well as he did. One of the raiders, a thick-shouldered brute with ritual scars covering his arms, looked up from where he was methodically destroying Jorund's herb garden. "The old wolf still has some bark in him," he called to his companions, grinning as he uprooted a sage plant that had taken 3 seasons to establish properly. "Perhaps he needs reminding of his place." The man straightened and walked toward Jorund with deliberate slowness, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. He was young enough to be Jorund's grandson, built like a bear and clearly confident in his ability to handle one aging recluse. The sneer on his face suggested he was looking forward to the exercise. "I am Ulf Ironbreaker," he announced, as if the name should carry weight. "I've killed 15 men in single combat. You will kneel and beg our mercy, old man, or I will add your grey head to my collection." Jorund studied the young warrior with the patient attention he had once given to battlefield tactics. Ulf was strong, certainly, and probably skilled with conventional weapons. But there was something in his stance, a slight favor of his left leg, that spoke of an old injury not fully healed. His sword was well made but heavy, designed for crushing rather than finesse. Most telling of all was the arrogance in his eyes, the fatal confidence of a man who had never faced a truly dangerous opponent. 15 men, Jorund repeated thoughtfully. Farmers? Merchants? Perhaps a few young raiders foolish enough to challenge you when you had backup nearby. Ulf's face darkened at the implied insult. Warriors all, you doddering fool! Real fighters, not some ancient relic playing in the dirt. The Thor hammer's grip rested on a stone shelf near the courtyard's edge, where Jorund had been using it as a decorative element in his latest garden design. It was a masterwork of the smith's art, an enormous war hammer that had belonged to his grandfather's grandfather. Its iron head inscribed with runes of power and its oak handle polished smooth by generations of warrior hands. He had retired it from active use decades ago, considering it too precious to risk in common battles. But its weight and balance were as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Real fighters, Jorund mused, taking a careful step sideways toward the hammer. Tell me, young Ulf, have you ever faced a man who helped break the siege of York? Who stood shield to shield with Magnus' bloody crown when the Danes thought to take Norway? Who earned his name by carrying a wounded comrade across a mile of battlefield, while arrows fell like rain? Old stories, Ulf sneered, but something in Jorund's tone made him pause. Dead glories. You're nothing now but a gardener. You're quite right, Jorund agreed, his fingers closing around the hammer's familiar grip. I am a gardener, and gardeners know all about pruning. The weight of Thor hammer's grip settled into his hands like a memory of youth. 40 pounds of iron and oak perfectly balanced, inscribed with runes that promised victory to the worthy and death to their enemies. Jorund had not wielded it in anger for 15 years, but muscle memory ran deeper than conscious thought. His stance shifted automatically, his grip finding the precise position that would deliver maximum force with minimal effort. Ulf's confidence flickered as he saw the transformation that had come over the old man. Where moments before had stood a bent gardener in a leather apron, now crouched something altogether more dangerous, a predator remembering its true nature. Draw your blade, Jorund said quietly. If you truly wish to add my head to your collection, you had best try to take it. Around the courtyard, the other raiders paused in their destruction to watch the confrontation unfold. Ragnar himself had climbed onto a pile of rubble for a better view, his cruel smile suggesting he expected to enjoy watching his subordinate humiliate the former legend. Only Munin seemed to understand what was about to happen. The great raven perched on the highest stone and began calling harsh warnings to the wind. Ulf drew his sword with a flourish meant to intimidate, the heavy blade catching sunlight as he brought it up in a guard position. He was competent enough, Jorund judged, probably capable of handling most opponents through sheer strength and reach. But competence was not mastery, and mastery was what this moment demanded. Last chance, old man, Ulf growled. Kneel now, and I'll make it quick. Instead of responding with words, Jorund moved. 7 years of careful garden work had kept his body supple, his reflexes sharp despite his age. The great hammer swept up and around in a deceptively lazy arc that gave Ulf just enough time to raise his sword in what he thought was inadequate defense. The collision between hammer and blade sent shock waves through both men's arms, but only one of them had expected the impact. Ulf's sword, fine steel though it was, bent under the tremendous force of the blow. The young warrior staggered backward, his confident smirk replaced by wide-eyed shock as he realized his weapon was damaged beyond use. Impossible, he gasped, staring at his bent blade. You're just an old man. I am Jorund the Broad-Back, came the measured reply, and suddenly the name carried all the weight it had possessed in darker days. I have broken armies and shattered shield walls. I have stood in the storm center of battles that lesser men flee from. 7 years of tending flowers has not made me forget how to tend death. The hammer came around again, and this time Ulf had no weapon to interpose. The flat of the iron head caught him across the ribs with a sound like breaking branches, lifting his feet clear off the ground and sending him tumbling across the courtyard to land in a groaning heap among the wreckage of the rose garden. A profound silence fell over the ruins of Ironhold. The raiders stood frozen, their destructive work forgotten as they stared at their fallen comrade. Ulf lay motionless among the scattered petals, his breathing shallow but steady, alive but thoroughly defeated. The bent sword lay beside him like a broken promise. Jorund hefted the great hammer and turned his attention to the remaining invaders, his eyes moving from face to face with the calm assessment of a man choosing which tree to fell next. The afternoon light caught the runes on the hammer's head, making them seem to glow with their own inner fire. "Who else wishes to test an old gardener's skill?" he asked conversationally. "I have 11 more lessons to teach, if any of you are eager to learn." The silence stretched until Ragnar's harsh laughter shattered it like a stone through ice. The blood-axe heir clapped his hands in mocking appreciation, his eyes bright with anticipation rather than concern for his fallen warrior. "Magnificent!" he called out. "The old wolf shows his fangs at last. But you've only delayed the inevitable, Jorund. One victory against 12 opponents proves nothing except that you'll die tired instead of fresh." The truth of those words settled like a cold weight in Jorund's chest. He had won this single combat, yes, but at what cost? His careful sanctuary lay in ruins around him, 7 years of patient work destroyed in minutes. And this was only the beginning. 11 more warriors remained, led by a man who would not make Ulf's mistake of underestimating his opponent, but looking around at the destruction they had wrought, at the trampled flowers and broken trellises. Jorund felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates finding a new position. Perhaps it was time to stop being a gardener and remember what it meant to be a warrior. If this was to be his final battle, he would make it one worthy of the sagas. Ragnar's laughter died away as he assessed the changed dynamic in his favor. One of his men was down, yes, but the old giant had revealed his hand too early. The element of surprise was gone, and now 11 alert warriors faced a single opponent. No matter how legendary his past might be. "Spread out," Ragnar commanded, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Form a circle. He cannot face all directions at once, and that hammer is too heavy for extended fighting. We'll wear him down and take him alive. I want him conscious when we find his treasures." The raiders moved with practiced efficiency, their earlier casual destruction replaced by the focused coordination of a wolf pack. They kept their distance, just beyond the reach of Jorund's massive weapon, forcing him to turn constantly to keep them all in view. It was sound tactics, and Jorund recognized the strategy even as he prepared to counter it. The ancient shield mount lay partially buried beneath a flowering vine near the courtyard's western wall, its bronze surface green with verdigris, but still solid beneath the patina. Jorund had discovered it during his first year of reconstruction, a ceremonial piece that had once held the war shield of some forgotten lord. He had incorporated it into his garden design as a trellis for climbing roses, their thorn stems now covering its surface in a lattice of natural protection. "You think like your father," Jorund called to Ragnar, backing slowly toward the shield mount while keeping his hammer ready. "All tactics and no imagination." Grim never understood that sometimes the best strategy is to abandon strategy entirely. "My father was cautious," Ragnar replied, signaling his men to tighten their circle. "I prefer to be thorough. Tell me, old wolf, where shall we start our search once you're dead? The deep cellars? The tower foundations? Perhaps your pretty gardens hide more than flowers." The casual mention of his gardens sent another spike of rage through Jorund's chest. 7 years of patient work, of coaxing beauty from ruins, and these fools would tear it all apart in their greed for treasures that existed only in their fevered imaginations. The roses he had bred for color and hardiness, the water features that had taken 3 seasons to perfect, the careful restoration of walls that honored both function and beauty, all of it would be rubble by sunset. "There are no treasures," he said again, but he could see the disbelief in their eyes. To men like these, beauty was worthless unless it could be melted down and sold. They would never understand that the true treasure of Ironhold was the sanctuary itself, the transformation of a place of war into a haven of peace. One of the raiders, a lean man with a fox-like face and quick eyes, grew impatient with the slow approach and darted forward, hoping to catch Jorund's flank while the old warrior was distracted by conversation. His mistake was assuming that age had dulled reflexes honed by 6 decades of combat. Jorund spun with surprising speed, the great hammer describing a brutal arc that caught the fox-faced raider across the shoulder. The impact drove the man to his knees with a cry of pain, his sword arm hanging useless as he scrambled away from the reach of that terrible weapon. 2 down, Jorund observed conversationally, though he could feel the exertion beginning to tell in his shoulders and back. The hammer was indeed heavy, and he was no longer 20. "Shall we continue this dance, or would you prefer to discuss terms?" "Terms?" Ragnar's voice carried genuine amusement. "You're surrounded and outnumbered. What terms could you possibly offer?" "Safe passage," Jorund replied, reaching the shield mount and using it to cover his back while he faced the remaining 9 warriors. "Leave now, take your wounded, and sail away. Continue this, and I promise you'll lose more men than you can afford." The bronze shield mount was solid against his back, its ancient strength still reliable after centuries of weathering. The roses that covered it released their fragrance as his movement disturbed the vines, filling the air with the sweet scent of summer blooms. For a moment, the contrast was almost overwhelming. Beauty and violence existing in the same breath, creation and destruction dancing their eternal dance. "Counteroffer," Ragnar said, drawing his own sword with deliberate ceremony. "Surrender now. Tell us where the gold is hidden, and I'll grant you a warrior's death instead of letting my men take you apart piece by piece." "Your father made similar threats," Jorund reminded him. "Ask his shade how well that served him." The mention of his father's death struck home as intended. Ragnar's face darkened with old fury, and Jorund could see the young man's careful control beginning to fray. Good. Angry enemies made mistakes, and mistakes were opportunities for a warrior who knew how to exploit them. But before Ragnar could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. High and clear and startlingly familiar, it carried from the direction of the harbor path with the unmistakable accent of Jorund's own bloodline. "Father?" Every eye in the courtyard turned toward the sound, and Jorund felt his heart stop as he saw the figure standing in the gateway where the great doors had once hung. Astrid, his daughter, no longer the girl who had sailed away 7 years ago, but a woman grown, her golden hair braided in the style of a ship's captain, and her blue eyes wide with shock as she took in the scene before her. Behind her stood 2 more figures. Eric, broader and more heavily muscled than when Jorund had last seen him, and a third person Jorund didn't recognize, a young woman with the bearing of a warrior and scars on her hands that spoke of many battles. "What is the meaning of this?" Astrid demanded, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. Her gaze moved from her father, hammer in hand and backed against a wall, to the scattered raiders and their fallen comrades. "Who dares attack Jorund the Broad-Back in his own hall?" Ragnar recovered from his surprise with admirable speed, though Jorund could see the calculation behind his eyes as he assessed this new development. 3 more opponents, but also 3 more sources of information about hidden treasures. "Lady," he said with exaggerated courtesy, "I am Ragnar Bloodaxe, and this is clan business. Your father owes a debt that has gone too long unpaid." "My father owes nothing to cowards who attack sleeping houses," Eric declared, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "State your grievance properly, or face the consequences." Jorund watched this exchange with a mixture of emotions too complex to name. Joy at seeing his children alive and grown, fury that they had chosen this moment to return, walking into a battle that was his alone to fight. Pride in their obvious skill and confidence, and underneath it all, a bitter irony that they had come home just in time to see everything he had built destroyed. "You came back," he said quietly, and Astrid's head turned toward him with an expression he couldn't read. "We came back," she confirmed, and there was something in her voice, regret perhaps, or apology. "Though it seems we arrived at an interesting time." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 11 enemies now facing 4 defenders, but the dynamics had shifted in ways that would take time to fully understand. Jorund hefted his hammer and wondered if this was how the Norns wove fate, bringing all the threads together at the moment of greatest tension, when the slightest move could send everything spinning toward triumph or catastrophe. The tension in the courtyard stretched like an overdrawn bowstring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Ragnar's men had instinctively shifted their positions to account for the new arrivals, but they maintained their aggressive stance, weapons drawn and ready. Jorund could see the calculation in their leader's eyes. 3 additional opponents meant greater risk, but also the possibility of capturing valuable hostages. Eric, Astrid. Jorund's voice carried a complex mixture of emotions as he spoke his children's names aloud for the first time in 7 years. "This is not your fight. These men came seeking treasure that doesn't exist, and they've destroyed." He gestured with his free hand toward the trampled gardens, the broken trellises, the scattered petals of his ruined roses. "They've destroyed everything I built here." Astrid's gaze swept across the courtyard, taking in details that her initial shock had prevented her from noticing. Her eyes widened as she saw the water features, the careful stonework, the way nature and human craft had been woven together into something beautiful and functional. This was not the abandoned ruin she had expected to find, but a thriving sanctuary that spoke of years of dedicated work. "Father," she said softly, and there was wonder in her voice. "What have you done to this place?" "He's made himself a pretty garden," Ragnar interrupted with a sneer. "Very touching, I'm sure, but we came for gold, not flowers. Your father owes the Blood-Axe clan a debt of blood and treasure, and today we collect." Eric stepped forward, his hand firm on his sword hilt. He had grown into his full strength during the years away, Jorund noted, and carried himself with the confidence of a seasoned warrior. "What debt?" "Speak plainly, or we'll settle this with steel." The Raven's Perch stood near the courtyard's center, a tall wooden post carved with intricate knotwork that Jorund had fashioned to give Munin and his corvid friends a proper roost. The great raven sat there now, his dark eyes fixed on the confrontation below with the intelligent attention of a creature that understood far more than most humans suspected. The carving itself told the story of Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, who flew across the 9 worlds each day to bring news to the All-Father. It had taken Jorund months to complete the intricate work, each intertwining pattern carefully planned and executed. "Your grandfather stole from my great-grandfather," Ragnar declared, his voice carrying the weight of inherited grievance. "A treasure hoard that should have been divided equally between our clans. Instead, Thorvald the Red claimed it all and brought it here to Ironhold. 3 generations have passed, but the debt remains." Jorund felt a bitter laugh escape his throat. "Thorvald the Red? That old tale? Your great-grandfather lost that treasure in a dice game, boy, fair and square. My grandfather won it honestly, and it was spent honestly on weapons and supplies for the defense of this coast against Danish raiders. There's been no hidden hoard here for 60 years. "Lies," Ragnar snarled, but Jorund could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Perhaps some part of him had begun to suspect that his family's legends were built on wishful thinking rather than historical fact. Astrid moved closer to her father, her eyes still taking in the details of his sanctuary. "The water," she said, pointing toward the cascade that flowed through the ruins in carefully engineered channels. "How did you manage to bring water through solid stone?" Patience, Jorund replied, surprised by the question. And understanding. The mountain wanted to give water to this place. I simply helped it find the way. He paused, studying his daughter's face. Why do you ask? Because, she said slowly, this is the work of an engineer, not just a gardener. The angles, the flow rates, the way you've directed erosion to carve channels instead of destroying foundations, this is mastercraft. The third member of their party, the young woman Jorund didn't recognize, stepped forward with the measured gait of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. She was perhaps 25 winters, with auburn hair bound in practical braids, and the lean build of a fighter who relied on speed rather than strength. Most tellingly, she carried herself with the alert confidence of a warrior who had seen real combat. I am Sigrid Ironhand, she announced, her voice clear and steady, Eric's wife and shield sister to Astrid. I've heard many stories of Jorund the Broad-Back, but none mentioned his skill as a builder. Wife. Eric had taken a wife, and from her bearing, a formidable one. Jorund felt a pang of loss for all the years he had missed, all the milestones unwitnessed, all the family bonds that had grown and strengthened in his absence. The stories you heard were of a younger man, he said carefully. Age changes a warrior's priorities. Not all warriors, Ragnar interjected, clearly growing impatient with the family reunion. Some remember their debts, some honor the blood of their fathers, and some, Eric said with quiet menace, are fool enough to threaten old men in front of their children. The dynamic in the courtyard shifted again as the three newcomers moved into defensive positions around Jorund. It was done subtly, without obvious coordination, but Jorund recognized the practiced movements of warriors who had fought together before. Whatever else had happened during their 7 years away, his children had learned to work as a team. Munin chose that moment to voice his opinion of the proceedings, releasing a harsh cry that echoed off the stone walls like a battle horn. The great raven spread his wings, displaying the impressive span that marked him as a patriarch among his kind, and called again with unmistakable aggression. Even the birds know you for what you are, Astrid observed, watching as several more ravens appeared from their roosts among the ruins. Carrion feeders drawn by the scent of coming death. Ragnar's patience finally snapped. Enough talk, he barked to his men. Take them, all of them. We'll sort out the truth once we have them properly motivated. The ravens erupted into flight as violence exploded across the courtyard. Jorund found himself fighting back-to-back with Eric, while Astrid and Sigrid took position near the fountain, their blades bright in the afternoon sun. 7 years melted away as muscle memory took over, the old combinations, the shared understanding of rhythm and timing that came from training together since childhood. But these were not the same children who had sailed away. Eric's swordwork had gained a brutal efficiency that spoke of many battles, while Astrid moved with the calculated precision of a ship's captain accustomed to making life-and-death decisions in moments of crisis. And Sigrid fought like a storm given human form, her blade weaving patterns of steel that left 3 raiders bleeding before they fully understood what they faced. The raven's perch stood in the center of it all, Jorund's carved masterwork serving as an anchor point around which the battle swirled. Ravens circled overhead, their calls mixing with the clash of steel and the cries of wounded men. And in that moment, surrounded by his children and fighting for the sanctuary he had built from solitude and loss, Jorund felt something he had not experienced in 7 long years. He felt like he was home. The battle raged with the fury of a summer storm, steel ringing against steel as 4 warriors fought against overwhelming odds. Jorund's great hammer swept in devastating arcs, each blow calculated to break weapons rather than take lives, a restraint that would have seemed impossible in his younger days, when mercy was a luxury few could afford. But 7 years of tending. Life had changed him in ways that even this violent resurgence could not entirely erase. Eric fought with the controlled aggression of a man who had learned warfare in harder schools than his father's training ground. His blade work was economical, each cut and thrust designed to end fights quickly rather than display skill. When one of Ragnar's men pressed too close, Eric's pommel strike dropped the raider with surgical precision, the kind of move that came from understanding anatomy as well as swordplay. "You've improved," Jorund called over the clash of weapons, parrying a spear thrust while driving his hammer's butt spike into his attacker's thigh. "Had good teachers," Eric replied through gritted teeth, his blade catching the afternoon light as he turned aside, a desperate sword cut. "Learned what happens when you're too proud to listen to wisdom." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Jorund felt something twist in his chest as he understood the implication. His son had learned humility the hard way, through defeats and failures that could have been avoided if he had possessed the patience to learn from his elders rather than dismissing them as obsolete. Astrid moved like water given lethal purpose, her blade finding gaps in her opponent's defenses with the uncanny precision of someone who had spent years reading the sea's moods and currents. She had always been the more intuitive of his children, the one who understood that true strength came not from force, but from finding the path of least resistance to your goal. "The water channels," she called to her father during a brief lull in the fighting. "You used the same principles for the stonework, didn't you? Following natural lines of stress instead of fighting them." It was an odd moment for architectural discussion, but Jorund found himself answering, even as he blocked a vicious axe swing. "Stone wants to stand just as water wants to flow. The trick is helping them do what they already desire." The Weatherstone sundial dominated the eastern corner of the courtyard, its granite face marked with lines that tracked the sun's progress through both day and season. Jorund had spent 2 full winters perfecting its calibration, learning to read the subtle shadows that marked not just hours, but the changing of seasons, the approach of storms, the optimal times for planting and harvest. The gnomon that cast its shadow was crafted from meteoric iron, a fragment of star metal that his grandfather had found on a beach in Iceland and treasured as a gift from the gods. Now that carefully calibrated timepiece was splattered with blood as Sigrid used its elevated platform to gain tactical advantage over her opponents. She fought with a style Jorund had never seen before, a fusion of Norse tradition with techniques that spoke of Eastern influences, movements that reminded him of stories he had heard about the Varangian guards who served in Byzantium. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked during another brief respite, genuine curiosity overriding the immediate demands of combat. "Constantinople," Sigrid replied, her blade weaving a defensive pattern that kept 2 raiders at bay while she caught her breath. 3 years in the Emperor's service teaches you things you can't learn in northern halls. Constantinople, the great city of the Romans, where gold flowed like water and warriors from every corner of the known world gathered to serve the Purple Emperor. That Eric had traveled so far, had served in such distinguished company, spoke of achievements that Jorund had never imagined his children might pursue, but there was no time to explore these revelations further. Ragnar had finally joined the battle himself, his sword bright with fresh steel and his eyes burning with the fury of a man watching his carefully planned raid dissolve into chaos. He was skilled, Jorund had to admit, perhaps not the equal of his legendary opponent, but dangerous enough to demand respect. "You've cost me 5 good men," Ragnar snarled as he engaged Jorund directly, their blades meeting in a shower of sparks. "I'll take that debt from your hide, old wolf." "Your men cost themselves," Jorund replied, his hammer describing a careful arc that forced Ragnar to give ground. They came seeking easy prey and found wolves instead. The young blood-axe heir was fast, faster than his father had been, and he pressed his attack with the reckless courage of youth. But speed without wisdom was just another form of weakness, and Jorund had been reading the patterns of combat since before Ragnar was born. The boy's technique was sound but predictable, all aggression and no subtlety. When the opening came, it was almost too easy. Ragnar committed to a powerful overhead strike that would have split an ordinary opponent from crown to sternum, but Jorund was not ordinary. He sidestepped with deceptive grace, letting the blade whistle past his ear while his hammer came up in a devastating uppercut that caught Ragnar squarely in the solar plexus. The young warrior folded like a sail losing wind, his sword flying from nerveless fingers as he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Jorund could have ended it there, could have brought the hammer down and crushed the skull of his family's ancient enemy. Instead, he rested the weapon's head against Ragnar's throat and spoke quietly. Yield. Around them, the sounds of combat faded as the remaining raiders realized their leader was defeated. Those still capable of fighting backed away from their opponents, hands raised in gestures of surrender. The battle was over, decided not by numbers or superior weaponry, but by the simple truth that skill and experience would always triumph over youth and arrogance. "I yield," Ragnar gasped, his face pale with pain and humiliation. "Quarter by the old laws." Jorund nodded and stepped back, allowing the defeated raider to struggle to his feet. "Take your wounded and go. You came seeking treasure that doesn't exist, and you've paid a price for your greed. Let that be lesson enough." But even as he spoke the words of mercy, Jorund could see the calculation in Ragnar's eyes, the way the young man's gaze moved across the courtyard, taking in details he had missed in his initial assessment. The weathered sundial with its meteoric gnomon, the intricate carving of the raven's perch, the obvious skill and effort that had gone into every aspect of the sanctuary's construction. "You're right," Ragnar said slowly, straightening despite the obvious pain in his ribs. "There's no ancient treasure here. But there's something else, isn't there? Something more valuable than gold." The word sent a chill through Jorund's veins as he realized what the young raider had discovered. Not hidden wealth, but visible worth. The accumulated work of 7 years, the transformation of ruins into paradise. To men like Ragnar, such a place would be valuable not for what it contained, but for what it represented. A sanctuary that could be taken, held, and used as a base for future raids. "This place," Ragnar continued, his voice gaining strength as his breathing steadied. "This fortress you've rebuilt, these innovations you've created, they're worth more than any hoard of silver. A man could hold this position against any enemy, control the entire fjord from these walls." The true threat crystallized in that moment, more dangerous than simple greed or inherited vengeance. Ragnar didn't want to loot Ironhold. He wanted to claim it, to make it his own stronghold, and use Jorund's careful work as the foundation for his own ambitions. The sanctuary itself had become the treasure, and that was a prize that no amount of mercy or martial skill could protect. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy with implications that transformed everything Jorund thought he understood about this confrontation. Ragnar's eyes gleamed with the light of discovery as he gazed around the courtyard, seeing not just a defeated raid, but an opportunity that dwarfed his original ambitions. "You see it now, don't you?" Ragnar said, his voice carrying a different quality. No longer the hot anger of youth, but the cold calculation of a man who had found his true purpose. "This isn't about old grudges or buried gold. This is about power. Real power." Eric stepped forward, his sword still drawn and ready. "Speak plainly. What do you want?" "I want what your father has built," Ragnar replied with startling honesty. "Look around you. This place is a fortress that could control every ship that enters or leaves this fjord. The modifications he's made, the water systems, the defensive improvements, the agricultural potential, this could support a proper warband indefinitely." Astrid's face had gone pale as she grasped the full implications. "You mean to take it? To drive out our father and claim Ironhold for yourself?" "Not drive him out," Ragnar corrected, and his smile was cold as winter iron. "I mean to hire him. A man with his skills, his knowledge of this place. He could be invaluable to the right leader. Think of it as a partnership." The Skald's speaking stone stood near the courtyard's northern wall, a massive granite boulder that Jorund had carved with intricate patterns representing the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology. In the old days, when Ironhold had been a thriving stronghold, visiting poets and storytellers had stood upon this stone to recite their tales for gathered warriors. Jorund had restored it not for grand assemblies, but for the simple pleasure of hearing his own voice echo properly as he worked, finding comfort in the acoustic properties that made even solitary speech feel less lonely. Now, with bitter irony, it served as a platform for Ragnar to address not just the immediate combatants, but the larger implications of what he proposed. "You don't understand," Jorund said quietly, his hammer still gripped in weathered hands. "This place isn't just a fortress, it's a sanctuary. A place where broken things can heal, where old warriors go to die gracefully," Ragnar interrupted. "Yes, I see that too. But grace is a luxury for peaceful times, and these are not peaceful times. The world is changing, old man. The kingdoms grow stronger, the seas grow more dangerous, and men like us need places like this to survive." Sigrid had moved to flank Ragnar while he spoke, her Eastern training evident in the way she positioned herself to strike from an unexpected angle. But the young Bloodaxe heir was not unobservant, and he held up a hand in a gesture that somehow managed to be both peaceful and threatening. "I didn't come here alone," he said conversationally. "My ship carries 30 men, not 12. The others are securing the harbor, making sure our departure isn't interrupted by unexpected arrivals." The words hit Jorund like a physical blow. 30 men, a proper warband, enough to hold this position against any reasonable assault. And if they had taken the harbor, they controlled the only practical way in or out of Ironhold, unless one was willing to climb the treacherous cliff paths that even mountain goats avoided. "You planned this," Eric said, his voice tight with understanding. "The attack, the apparent retreat, it was all theater." "The attack was real enough," Ragnar admitted. "I needed to test your father's capabilities to see what kind of opposition I might face. The results were educational. I knew he was legendary, but I needed to know if the legend matched the reality." Astrid's hand moved to her sword hilt. "And now you know. Now I know that Jorund the Broad-Back is exactly as dangerous as the stories claim," Ragnar agreed. "Which is why I want him as an ally rather than an enemy. A partnership, as I said. He continues his work here, improving and maintaining this place, while I provide protection and resources." "Protection from what?" Jorund asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "From the future," Ragnar replied. "The High King grows stronger each year. His tax collectors range further from his halls. And places like this, independent holdings without clear allegiance, they become problems that need solving. How long do you think you can remain hidden here? How long before royal ships arrive to demand tribute you cannot pay?" The truth of those words struck home like arrows finding their mark. Jorund had indeed been living outside the changing political landscape, focused so intently on his internal transformation that he had ignored the external forces reshaping the world around him. The old ways, where a strong warrior could claim a piece of land and hold it through force of arms alone, were giving way to something larger and more organized. "The High King's reach doesn't extend this far north," Eric said. But there was uncertainty in his voice. "Not yet," Ragnar conceded. "But it will. And when it does, isolated holdings like this will be absorbed or destroyed. Unless, of course, they have the backing of someone with the strength to negotiate from a position of power." The speaking stone seemed to amplify his words, giving them a weight and resonance that made them impossible to ignore. And Jorund found himself facing a truth he had been avoiding for years, that his sanctuary, no matter how perfect, existed in a world that was changing whether he acknowledged it or not. But before he could formulate a response, another voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Clear and commanding, it carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Stand down. All of you." The voice came from the gateway, and Jorund turned to see a figure that made his breath catch in his throat. Tall and straight-backed despite her advanced years, grey hair bound in the elaborate braids of a high-born lady, blue eyes that still held the fierce intelligence that had once made her the most sought-after bride in 3 kingdoms. "Mother," Astrid whispered, and the word carried a weight of emotion that spoke to years of separation and unspoken grief. Queen Ragnhild, Eric's daughter, Jorund's wife and the mother of his children, stood in the gateway like a figure from legend returned to life. She wore traveling clothes rather than royal robes, but there was no mistaking the bearing that had once graced royal halls and commanded the respect of jarls and kings alike. "Ragnhild," Jorund breathed, and suddenly every other consideration, the battle, the threats, the complex political maneuvering, faded into insignificance. She was alive. His wife, who had sailed away 7 years ago with their children, who he had assumed was living in some distant court, or perhaps had passed into the halls of the dead, was standing before him with eyes that held a mixture of sorrow, determination, and something that might have been hope. "My lord husband," she said formally, but her voice carried an undertone of warmth that made Jorund's heart skip like a young man's. "I see you've been keeping busy in our absence." Behind her came more figures, warriors bearing the insignia of the High King himself, their mail bright and their weapons of the finest steel. Not raiders or enemies, but royal guardsmen, whose presence transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Ragnar's face went ashen as he recognized the implications. His careful plans, his strategic thinking, his dreams of claiming Ironhold for his own, all of it crumbled in the face of this new reality. The High King's own guards did not travel without royal warrant, and their presence here could mean only one thing. "The High King extends his greetings to Jorund the Broad-Back," Ragnhild continued, her voice carrying the formal cadences of a royal proclamation, "and his invitation to join the court as royal engineer in recognition of your unique talents for transformation and construction." The plot twist was complete, devastating in its implications. Not only was his wife alive and returned to him, but she had come bearing an offer that would change everything. The sanctuary he had built in solitude was about to become the foundation for something larger, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous than anything he had imagined. The future he had been avoiding had arrived at last, carried in the person of the woman he loved and the royal authority she represented. And standing there in the courtyard, he had spent 7 years perfecting, surrounded by the evidence of his transformation from warrior to builder. Jorund realized that his greatest challenge was not behind him, but ahead. The question was no longer whether he could protect his sanctuary from those who would take it, but whether he could preserve what he had built while adapting to the demands of a world that had no intention of leaving him in peace. The silence that followed Ragnhild's announcement stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities that none of them had anticipated. Jorund stared at his wife, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the memories he had carried for 7 years. She was older, certainly, her face marked by lines that spoke of responsibility and difficult decisions. But her eyes still held the steel that had first captured his heart 4 decades ago. "The High King," he repeated slowly, testing the words like a man sampling wine that might be poisoned. "And what does Olaf Tryggvason want with an old warrior who tends gardens?" Ragnhild's smile carried a hint of the sardonic humor he remembered, the quality that had made her as dangerous in court politics as he had been on battlefields. "The High King wants what every wise ruler wants: stability, prosperity, and the loyalty of men who can make the impossible seem effortless." She gestured toward the water features, the careful stonework, the way Jorund had transformed ruins into paradise through patience and skill. "Word of your renovations it has traveled far, my lord. The king has need of someone who can build not just fortifications, but entire communities. Someone who understands both war and peace." Ragnar had recovered from his initial shock enough to find his voice, though he was clearly struggling to adjust his strategy to this new reality. "My lady queen," he said with exaggerated courtesy, "I fear there has been some misunderstanding. This place belongs to whoever the High King says it belongs to, Ragnhild interrupted, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had spent years navigating royal politics. And at present that remains Jorund the Broad-Back, master of Ironhold and keeper of his own destiny. The words were carefully chosen, Jorund realized. Not a royal command, but an offer, not conquest, but recruitment. The High King was wise enough to know that forced loyalty was worthless, that true power came from willing service freely given. But the underlying message was clear enough. Accept the offer, or face the consequences of remaining outside the new political order. Eric stepped closer to his mother, his expression a mixture of joy and wariness. Where have you been, Mother? When we sailed from here 7 years ago, you said you were going to visit your sister in the Orkneys. We searched for you there and found nothing. I did visit Thora, Ragnhild replied, her gaze moving between her children as if cataloguing the changes that 7 years had wrought. But the political situation required adjustments to my plans. The High King was consolidating his power, and there were opportunities for those wise enough to recognize them. Astrid's face had gone cold. The expression Jorund remembered from her childhood when she felt betrayed by adult decisions she couldn't control. Opportunities? You abandoned us, abandoned father. Let us believe you might be dead while you played politics in royal halls. I did what was necessary, Ragnhild said quietly, but there was pain in her voice. The old ways were ending, whether we acknowledged it or not. Your father could sit here in his ruins and pretend the world hadn't changed, but I couldn't let our family simply fade into irrelevance. The master builder's tools lay arranged on a stone table near the workshops where Jorund had spent countless hours perfecting his craft. Chisels and mallets, measuring devices and levels, all of them showing the wear of constant use, but maintained with the care of a craftsman who understood that good tools were the foundation of good work. Among them sat his most prized possession, a set of bronze calipers that had belonged to a Roman engineer, acquired in trade decades ago and used to ensure the precise measurements that made his water systems so effective. She's right. You know, Sigrid said unexpectedly, her Eastern accent lending weight to her words. The world is changing faster than any of us anticipated. In Constantinople, we saw the signs, kingdoms consolidating, trade routes shifting, old alliances crumbling. The age of independent warlords is ending. Jorund walked to the tool table and picked up the bronze calipers, feeling their familiar weight in his hands. 7 years of building, of creating, of finding purpose in solitude, all of it threatened now by forces he couldn't fight with hammer or sword. And if I refuse, he asked quietly, if I choose to remain here, tending my gardens and perfecting my paradise, then you'll be allowed to do so, Ragnhild said, and her honesty was perhaps the most unsettling thing she could have offered. The High King is not a tyrant, Jorund. He understands the value of skilled craftsmen, even solitary ones. But eventually the larger currents will reach even this remote fjord. Better to shape those currents than be swept away by them. Ragnar had been listening to this exchange with growing desperation, watching his dreams of conquest dissolve before his eyes. Now he stepped forward with the reckless courage of a man who had nothing left to lose. This is not how the sagas end, he declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard with surprising force. The son of grim Bloodaxe doesn't slink away defeated while old enemies feast in halls that should belong to him. His remaining men shifted nervously, clearly aware that their situation had deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery. The royal guards commanded by Ragnhild outnumbered them significantly, and their weapons and armor were of superior quality. But Ragnar seemed beyond such practical considerations. Driven by the weight of inherited grievances and the shame of public failure, Ragnar, Jorund said, his voice carrying the patient tone of an adult addressing a stubborn child. Your grandfather's claim was false, your father's hatred was misplaced, and your own ambitions are built on foundations of sand. Walk away, take your men and sail to wherever young warriors go to seek their fortunes. There's no honor to be won here. No honor? Ragnar's laugh was harsh and bitter. I came here to claim what was mine by right, and I find myself thwarted by royal politics and family reunions. But I won't leave empty-handed." His hand moved to his belt, not to his sword, but to something smaller, a carved bone whistle that gleamed white against the darker leather. Before anyone could react, he brought it to his lips and blew a sharp, piercing note that echoed off the stone walls like a battle cry. The sound was answered almost immediately by similar whistles from the direction of the harbor, a coordinated signal that spoke of careful planning and disciplined execution. Whatever Ragnar had intended as his contingency plan was now in motion, and Jorund felt a chill of apprehension as he realized how thoroughly he had underestimated his opponent's preparation. "What have you done?" Eric demanded, his sword halfway from its sheath. "Insurance," Ragnar replied with grim satisfaction. "My men have been busy while we've been talking. Your royal ship, my lady queen, by now it's been taken. Your crew overwhelmed. And unless I return to give different orders, it will be burned to the waterline with everyone aboard." The threat hung in the air like a death sentence, transforming the entire dynamic once again. Ragnhild's guards moved instinctively to protect her, but their disciplined formation couldn't address the larger strategic problem. If Ragnar's men controlled the harbor and had taken hostages, the political implications extended far beyond this isolated confrontation. You would murder innocent sailors to satisfy your wounded pride. Astrid asked, her voice tight with disgust. "I would do what's necessary to ensure my clan's survival," Ragnar replied. "Just as your mother did when she chose politics over loyalty. Just as your father did when he chose gardens over glory." Jorund set down the bronze calipers with deliberate care, his movements precise despite the turmoil in his mind. 7 years of peace, of building rather than destroying, and now he faced a choice that would determine not just his own future, but the fate of everyone in his sanctuary. "What do you want?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "A ship," Ragnar said promptly. "Provisions for my men. Safe passage from this fjord. And you," he pointed directly at Jorund, "you come with us. Your knowledge, your skills, applied to my purposes instead of royal ambitions, and if I refuse, then people die, starting with the royal crew and ending with everyone in this courtyard. I have nothing left to lose, old wolf. My reputation, my inheritance, my future, all of it is forfeit if I return home empty-handed. Better to die here than live as a failure." The ultimatum crystallized everything that had been building since the moment Ragnar's ship appeared on the horizon. Not just a simple raid or a family reunion, but a convergence of forces that would reshape the future of everyone involved. The sanctuary Jorund had built, the political opportunities Ragnhild represented, the family bonds that had been strained by 7 years of separation, all of it now hung in the balance. Munin chose that moment to settle on the raven's perch, his dark eyes fixed on Jorund with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The great bird had witnessed every transformation of this place, from ruins to paradise, from solitude to crowded conflict. Now he watched as his human companion faced the most crucial decision of his long life. The tools of creation lay before him, the weapons of war within reach, and the people he loved most, gathered around him in a circle of impossible choices. Whatever happened next would determine not just who controlled Ironhold, but what kind of man Jorund the Broad-Back would be remembered as, the warrior who had conquered enemies, or the builder who had transformed ruins into beauty, or something else entirely. The climax was approaching, and like the careful stonework of his water channels, every element was converging toward a single, inevitable point where all the gathered forces would either find harmony or tear everything apart in their collision. The weight of decision pressed down on Jorund like the burden of years, each possible choice branching into consequences that would ripple far beyond this moment. Around him, the sanctuary he had built with his own hands stood as silent testimony to what could be accomplished when violence gave way to creation. Yet now that very peace was threatened by the same forces that had driven him to seek solitude in the first place. How long? He asked quietly, his gaze fixed on Ragnar's face. How long for what? How long do I have before you lose patience and order your men to start the killing? Ragnar's smile was cold as winter iron, until sunset. The tide turns then, and if we're to make good our escape, we need to be sailing with it. That gives you, he glanced toward the westering sun, perhaps 2 hours to decide what matters more, your comfortable exile or the lives of innocent sailors. 2 hours. Jorund looked around his sanctuary, seeing it perhaps for the last time with the eyes of a man who had found peace here. The water cascading through channels he had carved with infinite patience. The gardens, where he had coaxed beauty from soil that had once been soaked with blood. The careful restoration of walls that honored both function and aesthetics. All of it would continue without him, or be destroyed in the violence that would follow his refusal. The founder's seal lay embedded in the courtyard's central flagstone, a bronze disc the size of a man's palm that bore the intertwined serpents of his bloodline. His great-grandfather had placed it there when Ironhold was first built, a symbol of legitimate authority and unbroken inheritance. Jorund had discovered it during his renovations, buried under centuries of accumulated debris, and had made it the centerpiece of his design. Now he knelt beside it, placing his weathered hand on the bronze surface that had been warmed by afternoon sunlight. "Father," Astrid said softly, kneeling beside him, "there has to be another way. Some strategy, some tactic that doesn't require you to sacrifice yourself for Ragnar's ambition. Do you see one?" Jorund asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Our enemy holds hostages we cannot reach, commands forces we cannot match, and has nothing left to lose. What strategy addresses those realities?" Eric moved to his other side, his young face marked by the same anguish that Jorund remembered feeling when faced with impossible tactical situations. "We could try to retake the harbor. Surprise attack, fast strike, resulting in the death of every hostage the moment we're spotted," Sigrid interrupted, her Eastern training evident in the cold calculation of her assessment. "Ragnar may be desperate, but he's not stupid. He'll have men watching every approach." Ragnhild stood slightly apart from the family group, her royal bearing intact despite the obvious strain of the situation. "The High King will not forget this insult," she said quietly. "Whatever happens here, Ragnar Bloodaxe has made himself an enemy of the crown. He knows this. It's why he's so desperate to escape with something valuable enough to justify his actions." "You," Jorund said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "He doesn't just want me as a craftsman. He wants me as a hostage, leverage against royal retribution. A man who takes the High King's designated royal engineer and his family could demand significant concessions," Ragnar confirmed, apparently unconcerned about revealing his strategy. "Safe passage to the Orkneys, perhaps, or the Irish kingdoms, where royal authority is more theoretical." Jorund's hand remained on the founder's seal as he considered the implications. Not just his own life at stake, but the future of his family, the stability of his wife's political achievements, the lives of innocent sailors who had done nothing more than carry a royal message to a remote fjord. "There is another way," he said slowly, an idea taking shape in his mind like water finding its proper channel, a way that honors both necessity and justice. "Father?" Eric's voice carried wariness born of long experience with his father's tactical innovations. Jorund stood, brushing stone dust from his knees, and walked to where his great hammer rested against the fountain's edge. Thorhammer's grip felt familiar in his hands, its weight and balance unchanged despite years of disuse. But as he hefted the ancient weapon, he was not thinking of violence, but of precision. Not of destruction, but of the careful application of force to achieve specific results. "I challenge you," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority of absolute conviction. "Single combat by the old laws. Winner takes all. Your life and the lives of your men, or mine and the freedom to leave unmolested." Ragnar's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "You would stake everything on a single fight? At your age, against my youth?" I would stake everything on the belief that skill and experience matter more than strength and speed, Jorund replied. Unless, of course, you lack the courage to face an old gardener with a hammer. The challenge hung in the air like a blade balanced on its point, ready to fall toward honor or shame, depending on Ragnar's response. Around them, witnesses held their breath, understanding that this moment would define not just the immediate crisis, but the very nature of how conflicts should be resolved in a changing world. Ragnar's hand moved to his sword hilt, his young face showing the struggle between caution and pride that had destroyed so many warriors before him. And if I refuse? If I simply sail away with my hostages and leave you to explain the failure to your royal friends? Then you prove yourself a coward unworthy of your father's name, Jorund said with brutal simplicity. And I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth to recover what you've stolen. The promise carried such conviction that no one in the courtyard doubted its sincerity. This was not the voice of an aging gardener, but of Jorund the Broad-Back in all his legendary fury, the warrior whose name had once struck fear into enemies across the northern seas. The gauntlet was thrown, the challenge issued, and now all that remained was to see whether Ragnar Bloodaxe possessed the courage to pick it up. Ragnar stared at the offered challenge for a long moment, his young face cycling through expressions of calculation, pride, and desperate ambition. The silence stretched until even the ravens seemed to hold their breath, perched on their wooden roost like dark judges, waiting to witness the final act of this unfolding drama. Single combat, he repeated slowly, as if testing the words for hidden traps. Winner takes all. But what guarantee do I have that your family won't interfere? That the royal guards won't rush to your aid the moment you start losing? You have my word, Jorund replied with simple dignity. And the word of Jorund the Broad-Back has been worth more than gold for 40 years. Ask any man who has fought beside me or against me. When I give oath, I keep it unto death. Ragnhild stepped forward, her royal bearing adding weight to her husband's promise. And you have my word as well, Ragnar Bloodaxe. Whatever happens in this combat, there will be no interference from my guards or my family. The old laws will be observed. The old laws, Ragnar mused, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of the young boy who had grown up on stories of legendary duels, of heroes who settled their differences with steel and courage rather than politics and maneuvering. Very well, I accept your challenge, old wolf. Let us see if age and cunning can triumph over youth and ambition. The combatants moved to opposite sides of the courtyard, while the witnesses arranged themselves in a careful circle. The royal guards maintained their positions, but lowered their weapons, honoring the ancient protocols that governed such contests. Eric and Astrid stood with their mother, their faces tense with worry, while Ragnar's remaining men gathered near the gateway, ready to flee or fight, depending on the outcome. The battle-blessed circle had been marked in the courtyard stones generations ago, its boundaries defined by bronze inlays that formed interlocking rings of knotwork. Jorund had carefully maintained these markings during his renovations, understanding their significance even though he had never expected to use them himself. Now the ancient circle would serve its original purpose, to contain violence, to give it meaning and honor, to transform mere brutality into something approaching sacred ritual. Jorund walked to the circle's edge and placed his hand on the bronze boundary marker. I, Jorund Thorson, called the Broad-Back, enter this circle willingly to defend my home, my family, and my honor. I call upon the gods to witness this combat and judge the righteousness of my cause. Ragnar approached the opposite side and made his own declaration. I, Ragnar Grimson, called Bloodaxe, enter this circle willingly to claim what is mine by right of conquest. I call upon the gods to grant victory to the warrior who deserves it most. The formal words completed, both men stepped across the bronze boundaries and into the sacred space where words would give way to steel. The circle seemed to contract around them, focusing all attention on the two figures who now faced each other across 20 feet of ancient stone. Ragnar drew his sword with ceremonial precision, the blade catching afternoon light as he brought it up in a classical guard position. He was indeed skilled. Jorund noted with professional appreciation his stance was balanced, his grip correct. His eyes focused on his opponent's center mass rather than being distracted by the massive hammer. Last chance to yield. "Old man," Ragnar called across the circle, "I'll grant you an honorable death if you kneel now." "I stopped kneeling to young fools before you were born," Jorund replied, hefting Thorhammer's grip with movements that spoke of decades of familiarity. "Come then, boy. Show me what passes for skill in your generation." Ragnar attacked with the explosive speed of youth, his blade cutting the air in a silver arc aimed at Jorund's neck. It was a good opening, direct, powerful, committed, but it carried the fatal flaw of overconfidence. The young warrior expected his speed to overwhelm his aging opponent, counted on reaching his target before the heavy hammer could be brought to bear. He was wrong. Jorund moved with the fluid economy of a master craftsman, every motion precisely calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum effort. Instead of trying to block the sword stroke, he stepped inside its arc, using his superior reach to bring the hammer around in a devastating counter that caught Ragnar across the ribs before the young man could recover from his committed attack. The impact lifted Ragnar from his feet and sent him sprawling across the circle's stones. His sword clattered away as he rolled, gasping for air, one hand pressed to his side where mail rings had been driven into flesh. But he was not finished. Youth recovered quickly from such blows, and he came up with a knife in his left hand, desperate courage replacing tactical thinking. "Well struck," he admitted through gritted teeth. "But I'm not done yet." "No," Jorund agreed with something that might have been regret. "You're not." The hammer rose and fell with the inexorable precision of fate itself, and when the echoes faded, only one warrior remained standing in the battle-blessed circle. The challenge was answered, the combat decided, and the ancient laws had claimed their due. Justice, it seemed, still had meaning in a changing world. The silence that followed the combat's end carried the weight of finality, broken only by the gentle splash of water flowing through Jorund's carefully crafted channels. Ragnar Bloodaxe lay still within the battle-blessed circle. His ambitions ended not by royal politics or overwhelming force, but by the simple truth that skill earned through decades of experience would always triumph over raw talent guided by desperation. Jorund stood over his fallen opponent, Thorhammer's grip heavy in his hands, and felt none of the fierce satisfaction that had once accompanied victory in combat. There was only weariness now, and the hollow ache that came from being forced to destroy when he had spent 7 years learning to create. "It's finished," he said quietly, his words carrying to every corner of the courtyard. The challenge is met, the combat decided. By the old laws, Ragnar's claims are forfeit, and his men are bound to honor the outcome. The surviving raiders looked among themselves with the desperate confusion of warriors whose leader had gambled everything and lost. They were skilled fighters, but without Ragnar's authority, they were just armed men in a foreign land, facing royal guards and legendary opponents with no clear path to victory or escape. Eric was the first to step forward, his relief evident despite his attempt to maintain a warrior's composure. "The hostages, father. Ragnar's men at the harbor will lay down their arms or face the consequences," Ragnhild interrupted, her voice carrying the crisp authority of royal command. "Captain Olsen, take half your men to the harbor. Secure the ship and ensure the safety of our people. Any of Ragnar's followers who surrender will be granted safe passage from these waters." The royal captain nodded and led 6 of his guardsmen toward the path that wound down to the harbor. Their departure left the courtyard feeling suddenly spacious. The immediate crisis resolved, but larger questions still hanging in the air like morning mist. Astrid knelt beside Jorund and placed her hand on his arm, her touch gentle despite the calluses that spoke of years handling ropes and weapons. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for leaving you here alone, for not understanding what you were trying to build." "You were young," Jorund replied, setting down his hammer and placing his weathered hand over hers. "Young people are supposed to seek their fortunes beyond their father's halls. I never blamed you for that, But we blamed you for being old, Eric said, joining them near the center of the circle. For slowing down, for wanting peace instead of glory. We thought it was weakness. Jorund looked around his sanctuary, seeing it now through his children's eyes. Not the retreat of a defeated warrior, but the masterwork of a craftsman who had found new ways to apply old skills. The water features that required engineering knowledge earned in a dozen sieges. The defensive improvements that incorporated lessons learned from decades of warfare. The agricultural innovations born of understanding how to supply armies in hostile territory. Strength comes in many forms, he said finally. It took me 60 years to learn that lesson. You've learned it younger than I did. Sigrid had been examining the intricate stonework of the water channels with the appreciative eye of someone who understood engineering. These flow rates, she said wonderingly. The precision required to achieve this kind of hydraulic balance in Constantinople, the Emperor's engineers would kill for this knowledge. Which brings us to the matter at hand, Ragnhild said, her tone shifting back to the formal cadences of royal business. The High King's offer stands, my lord husband, royal engineer with all the honors and responsibilities that entails. The realm has need of your skills. Jorund walked to the ancestral hearthstone and placed both hands on its cracked surface, feeling the familiar roughness of carved knotwork beneath his palms. 7 years ago, this stone had represented everything broken in his life. Family bonds shattered, purpose lost. Identity stripped away by the casual cruelty of children who thought they knew better than their elders. Now, it seemed different. Not broken, but marked by experiences that had shaped it into something stronger. The crack that ran through its center no longer looked like a flaw, but like a lightning bolt, the kind of mark that gods left on things they had touched with power. The High King's offer is generous, he said slowly. But I would propose an alternative. Ragnhild's eyebrows rose in surprise. An alternative? A partnership. Ironhold remains my home, my sanctuary, my workshop. But it also becomes a school, a place where the King's engineers can come to learn the techniques I've developed here. The knowledge doesn't belong to one man or one realm. It belongs to anyone wise enough to choose creation over destruction. The proposal hung in the air as his family considered its implications. Not exiled to a royal court, but the transformation of his sanctuary into something larger while preserving its essential character. A bridge between the old ways and the new, between solitary mastery and shared knowledge. The king would accept such an arrangement? Eric asked. The king is a practical man, Ragnhild replied with a slight smile. He wants results, not ceremonies. If Jorund can train a generation of engineers who understand both warfare and construction, both siegecraft and agriculture, it would be worth more than any individual service. Munin chose that moment to land on Jorund's shoulder, the great raven's weight familiar and comforting. The bird had witnessed every transformation of this place, from ruins to sanctuary to battlefield to negotiating ground. Now he would see it become something new again. Not just a home for one old warrior, but a seed from which new forms of knowledge could grow. As the sun touched the western mountains and painted the fjord in shades of gold and crimson, Jorund felt the deep satisfaction that came from work well done. Not the fierce joy of victory in battle, but the quiet contentment of a builder who had created something lasting, something worthy of preservation and expansion. His children were home, his wife had returned, and his sanctuary would endure not as a monument to solitude, but as a living testament to the power of transformation. The old wolf had indeed learned new tricks, and perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. The future stretched ahead like unworked stone, full of possibilities waiting to be shaped by patient hands and clear vision. And for the first time in 7 years, Jorund the Broad-Back looked forward to tomorrow.